Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hands-on CISO podcast. My name is Adi, and today we're going to chat with Chris Denbigh-White, who's been in the security field for over a decade and is currently the CISO of NextDLP.
Hi, Adi. Great to be here.
Perfect. So, Chris, before we even get into anything about what you're doing now, I'd love to hear how you got into security.
No problem at all. I have what they call a non-standard path into information security, and it's kind of odd. So roll back many, many years, and my university degree is in applied theology. So I was trained, and I'm trained to be a minister of the church, which is, you don't necessarily find a lot of CISOs who are, trained to be church leaders. So my aim was to work in outreach and to work, doing aid work abroad. I met my wife on the course there. Some things in my family meant that my father passed away and my wife's mother did. So we decided to spend some time putting down roots in the UK first. So I got a job. I joined the police. I'd, prior to that, worked abroad. I speak a number of different languages. And I got moved into kind of working in counter extremism, which was an interesting field. Then ended up working in cyber in that area, and then building the computers and building the infrastructure that we would do our work. Then ended up working outside in Transport for London. Then worked in consultancy and then banking, and then now that's kind of how I got into it. I've always been a massive geek, and I've kind of pushed my career into doing the things I genuinely enjoy, and it just so happens I genuinely enjoy being a CISO and running a security program. So that's the last 10 years-ish. So yeah.
Cool. So you've been doing security in many different areas, and before that you were something completely different, like what you thought you were going to do.
Exactly. I thought I was going to be working with homeless children in Mexico, but actually I found myself, like I say, working kind of counter-extremism for a while, and then building the infrastructure that they would do the counter-extremism work on in the UK, and then building this properly. And back then, building an infrastructure properly kind of was cybersecurity in a way, because I came in, I got brought in after somebody unexpectedly quit, because I was working at Intel, and they were basically the powers that be at the time were, oh, Chris, you're a massive geek, you can run the database. And I said, yes, absolutely, I can do that. I know how to do this, but I'm not touching this very sensitive national security stuff until you put me through this course, this course, this course, and this course, the Microsoft stuff, the databases and security. So that's what I did. They liked what I did. I could do it, and I kind of did the training and iterated from there. So I'd be, okay, so this needs securing now. I kind of know how to secure it because I've been playing and breaking stuff for years. Okay, these are the courses that I'd like to do. A pen testing course, a network forensics course, and then implementing those functionalities into the infrastructure that I was building for the unit I worked for. And then people liked what I did, so they asked me to third eye the designs of other people's work, and I'd say, well, actually, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, and then kind of got into that line of work. So it was very much deciding what I wanted to do, and I was lucky enough to be able to push the boundaries to be able to almost make my job description what I wanted to do. So I was doing kind of my day job at the time, but also slowly but surely diverted what my day job was more over to a cybersecurity, designing defensible infrastructure, if you see what I mean.
Amazing. And what does your day-to-day look like now versus what it looked like when you were just starting out as a CISO?
Oh, day-to-day now is I run the security team for a security software company now. So it's kind of odd in a sense in that it's the day-to-day stuff you'd expect of a CISO. So we look at the things like our product security. So we have a PCERT team that makes sure that as a security company, we build software that is in itself secure. So that's all the good things, like pipeline security, shifting lefts, static analysis, dynamic analysis, and teams to remediate the stuff in that. So I oversee and look after that on one side. And on the other side, kind of your classic information security role of the business security. So things like ensuring that our email system is secure, people are adequately trained in cybersecurity, we're meeting and passing the right kind of compliance requirements, in our case ISO 27001, and ensuring that that program runs and is consistently improving. So that's my day now. My day back, if we kind of go back to kind of when I was working in building and looking at infrastructure, was 50% of the day would have been tracking the movement of ISIS material. That's what the unit I worked for did. It was, kind of a video or some stuff would be brought out, and we'd try and figure out where it was going, where it originated from, and to be able to real world house those people, kind of big OSINT type work. And then the other 50% of the time was looking to improve the infrastructure that work was taking place on, because it was very, very, very much 20-year-old thinking as to how that should be done. So I was implementing an enterprise grade thing, which basically brought in kind of elements of logging and monitoring, both for external attacks, but also for ensuring the safety of the users who we were using kind of the infrastructure as well. So back then it was a really interesting challenge to have, because normal companies would have, this is a business relevant website or business relevant activity to do. And that will be, you allow a certain degree of shopping, or you allow to go onto news sites and things like that, or travel sites, plan a trip on kind of the underground from here to here. Whereas that use case where I was working before be flipped entirely on its head. We would want people, and it would be expected for people to go to the darkest, dirtiest parts of the internet, the places that would usually be banned out of hand. Yet, because it was a quasi-covert unit, we wouldn't want them journey planning or doing anything to do with their real lives on the internet and leaving a trace that way. So there was a lot of reprogramming the behavior rules to allow what normal people would perceive as the horrific and ban relatively normal stuff. So it was really interesting in that sense and quite different to what I do now.
It sounds like they're both security, but they're completely different focuses.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the focus is the same. The outcome's the same. That's to ensure what the business needs to do is done in a secure way without compromising business security or compromising the staff, and providing a safe environment for people who work for a company to work in, almost like a health and safety thing. In the physical security world, we provide safe spaces for people to work. Offices and desks, so people don't get sore backs or electrocuted by their plugs. In the same way, I see being a CISO in information security is providing companies and providing the staff that work for my company a safe space to operate in the world of computers and data, where, to the most part, they have guardrails and safety around them so they can do their jobs in a safe way without risking leaking or losing data. That's kind of essentially, whether it was back then or now, that's always been my aim.
So it's interesting for me to hear your perspective on how different companies, obviously they relate to security in different ways, but specifically in the field of how much is the responsibility of the employee versus the CISO, in terms of, are the employees very educated, like everyone's making sure that everyone is okay, or are there actual systems that make sure no one makes mistakes in a way?
It's a really great question. I think it's down to wider company culture and company size as well. For example, company I work for now, in comparison to some of the companies I've worked for in the past, is relatively small. So it is possible to have, although I don't know everybody like deep down personally inside the company I work for, I know everybody by name. I have an understanding of the work that they do, and they're not a name on a spreadsheet or a name outside. Whereas if you worked for a large company like the finance company I worked for previously, with 100,000 odd workforce globally, there's no way you could get to know everybody. So I think the approach is different based on the budget and the size of the company. However, the ethos I've seen is a lot like again, I spoke of guardrails a moment ago and providing a safe space in which for people to work. I think that should be true regardless of where you work and what size of company you are. And it's a difficult problem with larger companies. It involves understanding business flows, what the business does and what the business needs to do first, and then seeing security as a facilitator to that, rather than coming at the problem with this is a framework like ISO or NIST or something with a whole load of controls that we will switch on and block stuff essentially. And I think that's where a lot of my colleagues, and I in the past as well, have come unstuck a little bit by, saying, okay, so this, we need to stop this happening, blah blah blah. It needs to not happen because it's bad, universally, without necessarily taking the time to understand what the business does. So I think, in answer to your question, to achieve this across the board, I think it's about understanding what the business does and employing adequate communication strategies to be able to engage the wider business, if you see what I mean.
Interesting. Have you ever, in any of your companies, the companies that you worked at, or even now, although I guess in a cybersecurity company there is more of an awareness, but did you ever feel like a bad cop? Like you were the one who's in charge, that nobody's doing anything?
I always try not to be the bad cop, but sometimes you have to be, because it's always the interplay between what the business needs to do and making things have a lack of friction, for the business, and also having defensible security as well, And if we take things to extreme, if we wanted the business to be like ultra fast and be able to do everything, then have no passwords for anything. Just have somebody log on to, a resource and they're in instantly with no authentication whatsoever. But, that's not great for business because, very, very quickly the business would lose all its data, be fined by everyone and, probably go out of business. So it's finding that sweet spot of kind of being able to say no sometimes, but always provide reasons and alternatives, again, not wanting to consistently talk about guardrails, but I always try and be, rather than a roadblock in the path of business, I always try and be kind of the bumpers on the side, like in a bowling alley, when you take your kids to bowling, that's kind of the aim really, is that if I do have to implement a block of stopping something specifically happening, then I need to also understand what the alternative is to achieve the business outcome. And to do that, I need to understand what the business outcome is. And to do that, I need to engage with the business and ask them, what is your business outcome? What are you trying to achieve here? And if it is, I want to watch Netflix during the working day, then, and if that's not something we allow our staff to do, then yes, of course, it's going to be a no and I have to be bad cop. But at least I've understood what the aim is, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, interesting. Have you ever encountered, obviously you don't have to say companies or anything, but a really bad security mess up that you had to sort of deal with real time?
There's been a few, and it would be really easy for me to start throwing mud, but everybody has done. Anybody that's worked in information security or on IT for long enough has made mistakes. Anybody that's worked in networking has at one point in their career, I can guarantee you, switched something off remotely in a data center that they shouldn't have done, and had to jump in a car and drive very, very fast, numerous miles, to then manually go and switch it on. Anybody that says that they haven't been in that position and has worked in networking over a certain amount of time, I would probably say is lying, absolutely. But just a couple of things I've seen that have been really quite bad is I worked in an environment that had fiber optic networks to the computers at the endpoint. They had that for security because they were very nervous about radio-based attacks against normal network cables. Again, whether or not that was an actual risk is another thing, but the rules were there. Fiber optic cables for everything. They were the data that they processed was quite sensitive. And when I came in and took over and we're doing a security review, we saw a printer at the end of the office, and we're like, there isn't from what we know from the floor plans, there isn't a fiber network port by that printer. How is this printer working? So we pulled it out and we had a look, and we saw that what the person who had configured this old office had done was they'd got a thing called a media converter, which is where you get one type of networking, you plug it in, and it changes it to another. Now, this media converter converted the very secure fiber network into a very insecure Wi-Fi network to beam the printer traffic across the office to where the actual port was, and then back into the fiber network. Hideously horrible security failing, and we're glad we found it. So we've seen stuff like that. And again, it's the person that did that was, it was foolhardy, but you can understand why they do that. They were trying to get the job done and under difficult circumstances, but that was something quite horrific. Things I
How
see
do you deal
relatively
with a situation like that? What do you do?
well. In that case, you have to kind of understand. You need to figure out how long the printer's been in that state, what has been transmitted down it, a lot of reporting upwards and acrosswards in relation to calculating the risk exposure. Okay, so if this has been the case and the printer and or the network has not been used, then that's quite small and limited. But then, when you encounter those things, it's understanding, some people call it blast radius, some people call it scope of impact, of understanding worst case scenario of this happening, understanding most likely worst case scenario, and then having a plan to do the various things that need to be done, either informing people or lessons learned. Obviously the lessons learned for this one's quite obvious. Don't do it in the first place, but more regular kind of inspections of kind of networking equipment was one of the learning outcomes from that. But no, it was interesting.
Well, sounds like it's like what you were trained for has happened, which is terrible, but also now like things are being tested, like all the plans.
Exactly, and I think you have to test these plans, tabletop exercises. Although some people think, let's do the yearly tabletop exercise, it's a bit of a drama. These things can actually be quite fun if you have a situation where people are safe to fail. I think it's important, again, when we speak of good cop, bad cop, that if people make mistakes, if people, click a link in a phishing email, or if people do the wrong thing for whatever reasons, they need to be confident to come forward. Because the worst thing that you can have in these situations in data security is a big gaping hole that people are afraid to report and afraid to report to the right people, so remediation can take place. I'd much rather hear that something bad has happened from an internal member of staff very quickly after it's happened than to hear it 3-4 months down the line from an attacker who's either ransomwared the entire infrastructure, or from a customer, or from a third party that's asking why my infrastructure is attacking their infrastructure. Those are conversations CISOs never really want to have. So I think, again, back to my role now, breeding that openness of staff to be able to report and have that two-way communication with the CISO's office is really, really important.
Interesting. What would you say that in today's current security scene is the biggest threat for companies?
I'm going to turn it on its head here and kind of say I think the biggest threat for companies at the moment is underestimating the benefits of addressing the basics of information security first. I see a rather worrying trend propagated by vendors mostly, but also some CISOs as well, is to have a very, very laser focused on the latest APT threats or 0-day vulnerabilities. And are we implementing AI to detect our 0 days attacks from China, Russia, United States, Britain? Everybody attacks everybody else. I'm not going to throw mud at one specific country, because I think we're all grown up enough to know that, everybody attacks everybody else. But the real risk isn't, APTs or nation state attacks, or even if it were, the majority of nation state attacks or large criminal gang attacks aren't going to use 0 days, because the sad fact remains that they don't need to, because companies time and time again fail to do the basics of asset inventory, application inventory, network protections, properly configuring networks, properly configuring user accounts. These are the really boring quite hard, basic things to do. But time and time again, you look at all the breaches that happen and ransomwares, and you look, it's really simple thing like multi-factor authentication not switched on. So those are the risks, I think, that companies don't do these really basic, really boring, quite tedious things. And they tend to just purchase a box which will protect against something potentially. But there's a whole lot of basic initial work that needs to be done that I just, time and time again, I don't see being done in general.
Interesting. Do you think they don't do it because they don't think it's like a threat, or do you think they just don't do it because they're not thinking about it?
I think they don't do it because it's hard, and it is hard. It's say, oh, do the basics. It seems quite simple, but when you think of something like, for example, an asset inventory, keeping track of all the laptops and computers that you have in a company. Our company's relatively small, but that's quite hard. But then you take it to things like cloud resources. Okay, so you have an asset inventory of every computer that you have, but okay, so does that include the VMs that exist in AWS or GCP? Or how about these VMs that only exist for half an hour, or these microservices or containers that get thrown up? How do we manage asset inventory with something that only exists for half an hour when it's in use and then ceases to exist? Is that then code security? So these are wider, larger problems that require design thought from the start. And the problem is that many companies haven't done that first. So they're almost trying to play catch up with things like identity, asset management, patching and stuff. So it is really hard. And some of these things are business impactive as well. Even something as simple as patching. A security professional or somebody who's ticking an audit box will say, oh, a critical patch is released. You need to have that patched within the shortest period of time whatsoever. You need to patch it immediately, within 4 hours, within 24 hours, certainly no longer than a month. But you speak to any IT person and they say, oh, well, a brand new patch from MS has been released. Are we going to push this to our entire infrastructure blindly within 2 hours? Certainly not, because some of these patches break systems. So it's a wider risk question between, okay, so is the risk of this critical patch not being put in place higher, lower than the risk of the estate not being functional for a certain period of time because the patch has broken something, or we have to bring the systems down in order to patch first or to test the patches? So, although these things are basic, they're time consuming, somewhat tedious, and they're not especially sexy. So I think given a big list of kind of quite boring stuff that, and new stuff, I can't speak for other CISOs, but in answer to your question, it's hard. The basics are hard, but the basics are foundational, and without them, the top can't survive, as with all foundations.
Interesting. What is something that is, as a CISO, keeping you up at night? Like something that you think should be getting more attention?
Well, the basics, that keeps me up at night. But also, I think figuring out ways in which to present the quite dry topic of information security to engage the wider business as well. Because when we talk about the need for patching and the need for visibility of what's happening on endpoints and stuff, I always try and always aim to be not that geek in the corner that throws around kind of technical words at board level, because to be honest with you, that's not their job. Their job is to run if they're, on the board and they're in charge of finance, their job is to understand finance. Or, if it's marketing, it's to understand marketing. My job is to understand security, and my job is to be able to explain that in a way that is in business language and is about reducing business risk as opposed to just my own little kingdom of cybersecurity. So I think that keeps me up at night, trying to figure out ways as different attacks happen and different technologies happen, and also keeping my eye on random bits of news that make the mainstream media as well. Because as CISOs, we always get asked, 80% of the times an irrelevant question from somebody else on the leadership team where they've read something that, is the worst possible thing happening ever. And we spend a reasonable amount of time writing what I like to refer to as, we really need to calm down response documents and PowerPoints. I've done this in my past. It's like, actually, no, we don't have this technology. This attack is only theoretical. and quantum computing is not quite there yet for this attack. So let's focus again on the things that matter today as opposed to looking at the future. So those are the kind of things that keep me up at night, is ensuring I maintain being relevant to the company I work for, and I don't fall into that trap of a rabbit hole of deeply technical stuff, which I find thoroughly interesting as well, but not everybody else does.
Interesting. How do you navigate, on the one hand, doing all the tasks that you have to do and working with other people, just like the daily things, and at the same time, learning so much about this field that is changing, it seems, every day, and every day new things are coming out, and you have to keep on top of everything?
It's really hard, and I think it's kind of a discipline thing. I'll throw out some resources I use, which I find really useful, and I say this to people I work with and my team as well, is there's something called the SANS Internet Storm Center's Daily Stormcast. It's a bit of a mouthful, but there's a chap called Dr. Johannes Ulrich, who is a big SANS instructor, and he has a team of threat researchers, and he does a daily 6-minute podcast, which is, this is what's happening in cybersecurity. These are the vulnerabilities. This is what attackers are generally doing. They've got honeypots and stuff, entirely free. And it's a really great way to kind of have some bite-sized information of what's happening today. You know, what things are in the Microsoft Patch Tuesday of notes and a rundown without necessarily having to read all of the documentation. That's super useful. Again, I have threat feeds, largely free ones, and news feeds come in, to read around stuff that's happening. Taking part in the information security community, I think, is really important as well. Something I've always done is go to these meetups. Pre-COVID, it was a lot easier. There were a lot more of them. But these meetups where you're able to discuss information security and discuss CISO and cybersecurity with peers in a friendly environment, and you build up those relationships where you can go, I've got this problem with this. How would you deal with it? And just being able to surround yourself with people you can bounce ideas around with in a safe environment. I think that's vital. I think it's really bad when you get in a situation where you feel quite alone and unable to lean on anyone else for support, because in most companies, CISOs are quite alone. Very rarely is there the security budget to have a cast of thousands. So those are some of the things that I would prioritize to do alongside the day-to-day tasks. And I think by doing that, you kind of fulfill two things, really. You have the knowledge objectives of being able to keep up to date with things, but you also give yourself that segmentation of the work that you do as well. And I think it makes you feel more supported in a emotional and professional sense as well.
Interesting. Right now, in the company that you work in, that is not a huge company, are you working as a CISO? As I'm assuming from what you said, you're not the only person who's doing security, so you have a team?
Yes, I have quite a small team, and we've embraced again, it's a buzzword, a shift left scenario with our company as well. And I hate buzzwords usually, because sometimes they mask not actually doing the thing the buzzword is for. But in our case, we have. So I have a small team, but also with product security, we cycle in members of the dev team into the product security team as well, almost like an exchange program. So they will work with the current security team, and where there are bugs or things that need fixing in the product that are identified through our PSERT process, they will go and take ownership of that. So they will kind of fix the bug, understand it, write the vulnerability disclosure piece as well, look for similar. So although we have quite a small team, we kind of co-opt the rest of the company to be part of it as well, which is brilliant for the dev team in that example, because they then fix one of the bugs. So they then identify the type of things when they go on to then write more stuff inside of our product. They potentially will have more of a mind for security. So it trains them in secure coding at the same time as brings the awareness, and it works really well. I'd love to take credit for that. I didn't set that up. That was my predecessor prior to me taking on the role. But I've certainly nurtured that further, and that seems to be working really well. And that, for a smaller company, I think is vital, to be able to co-opt as many people inside the company to do security without necessarily realizing they're do security. It's a cultural thing in a lot of ways.
Is that something that is common in companies?
I don't know. I think a lot of people are trying to do that, but I think there's always going to be a tension, especially in a small software company, between dedicating the resources to do that kind of thing for the wider development side to see the value in giving up a development resource for the PSERT program periodically. I think a really good way to kind of sell this into the dev side is to show them actually the time saved by building things well, and also to senior management by having one of these programs. Third-party risk management conversations are a lot easier as well. It shows quite a mature security program. The people doing assessments of us as a company really seem to like that. So I think, I'm not sure how common it is, but it is certainly achievable.
Cool. How would you say being a CISO in a company that is 100 people or even really smaller companies versus being a CISO in a huge company, like thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands?
That's great. Just to be clear, I wasn't a CISO in a huge company. I was kind of senior security people there as well. But I think the role differs. At the moment, I have teams and people that do various things, but I'm also still quite hands-on. If something needs all hands to the pump, I'm able to do it, and it's right and proper for me to get in and start configuring stuff, and that's absolutely fine. I think the larger the company you work for and the more staff you have under you, it becomes more of a management and setting the general direction type role. And I think the skill there is firstly in having the lines of reporting and ensuring efficiency takes place between the different teams, but also having the discipline to not micromanage too much as well. I think there's that phrase, I can't remember where it's from, is, leadership is having the serenity to let somebody else do a job that you deep down feel you could do better than they could. It's true or not true, but I think it's important to, where I have worked in larger kind of companies and had teams under me, I think that's where you have to be quite careful to set strategic goals for your teams, especially if you're sitting at kind of overseeing a manager. It's like three tiers down to the people that actually do the work. Set the overarching goals and let your managers manage. Because I think you can burn through a whole load of time as a leader, invoke a whole load of stress by not trusting your teams. And I think that you either need to trust your teams or get some new teams, or develop your teams. You can't fall into that trap of having your hand on too many things, because for larger companies you're not going to have the time, and you're either going to burn yourself out or you're going to thoroughly annoy your teams, and they'll either leave or not perform as well as you hope they would. So yeah, I think it's a different kettle of fish.
Interesting. How do you see the cybersecurity field changing within the next 2, 5, 10 years?
Not wanting to harp on about AI and large language models, but I am going to comment on it because everybody else seems to be commenting on it. People tend to fall into like various categories. Either it's the best thing since sliced bread, and AI and large language models are going to mean that I have to do virtually no work whatsoever. I'll just press the do CISO button on my computer and the LLM will do the rest for me. Or there's the doom naysayers that think it's going to be something akin to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and the robots are going to take over the world. Whereas I think probably what will happen is going to be somewhere in the middle, really. There are lots. Large language models are great tools, but they are tools and they don't solve business problems. I think what is going to happen over the next few years certainly is that security leaders like myself and business leaders across the board are going to have to figure out, okay, so we have this tool, we have this hammer or this screwdriver, which is a large language model. We need to figure out the business problems we want to solve with it and figure out whether or not it's the right tool for it. It's not let's simply ask the LLM what it thinks it can do. I think that there's going to be that rationalization of kind of adopting this technology in a safe way, understanding the data flows of it from a security perspective, but I've no doubt it will be part of our everyday business world, but I think the companies and the executives that are going to be successful are the ones that understand the questions they would like to answer first before they implement AI, rather than assuming that the technology is going to give them answers. And that's been the case for any technology. It's the same with kind of SIEM was 5, 10 years ago. Everybody purchased Splunk or ArcSight or whatever SIEM they wanted, and they piped all of their data into it. And then they asked themselves the question, why am I not more secure? Where are my dashboards? And, the security professional said, well, what questions do you want to ask of the data? And the security leaders were like, well, we hope the product would tell us that. And it's actually, well, no, you still need, as a leader in security or in business, to know what you want to do and to have a strategic plan. Technology is not going to write that for you. So I think that's going to be one of the major changes I see over the next 5 years, is looking at how the adoption of AI and LLMs and the security side of this evolves based on how well people can figure out what they're good for, what they're not good for, and what they want to do.
Interesting. Would you say that the job of a CISO is more techy, more business, or does it sit like right in the middle? Because it seems that different CISOs have their different approaches or what they prefer, but how do you see it?
I think the role of CISO is very undefined at the moment as well. Because, for example, I report into the CEO at the moment, and I believe that's the right place for a CISO to report into. I'm on the senior leadership team, I've got a C title and the responsibility that goes with it. But that's not universal. And there are many CISOs that report into CTOs or CIOs, or are actually, by and large, upper middle management as opposed to senior management. So I think it depends on the role title. You've even got regional CEOs in large financial companies like banks, for example. You've got CISOs for UK and CISOs for EMEA and CISOs for America, who report into somebody who reports into a global CISO. So they have a job title because there's various rules and regulations that require that job title to exist in a specific region. Whether or not that's the same job as a CISO who reports into a CEO that runs an entire security function. So, yeah, I think it's different in relation to kind of whether or not they should be technical or whether or not they should be business focused. My personal opinion is I think they should be both. I think that it is vital for a CISO to know enough of the technology stack to understand when their technical teams or indeed vendors trying to sell them things are trying to pull the wool over their eyes. They don't necessarily need to be able to code, but they need to understand the fundamentals of what the technology is trying to achieve. But on the flip side, they also need to be able to speak a business language. They need to understand the strategic imperatives of the business that they serve and be able to speak in those terms. Now, that isn't necessarily always possible in one person. So if the person is more business inclined, then they need to ensure that they have trusted people reporting into them who are technical advisors into the CISO's office. So somebody, the CISO, can say, okay, so explain this to me, this technology or this problem and this threat, and then, a buffer. And that, I think, depends varying on size of the company as to kind of how you can have that. And on the flip side, if somebody's overly technical, then maybe a trusted project manager or a trusted business architect working into the CISO's office to temper what the CISO says in relation to communicating with the wider business. But in answer to your question, I think both are vital, because I think we need to understand the technology that we're wanting to protect and the technology that looks after the data. But on the other side, we also are serving a wider business. There isn't necessarily cybersecurity risk or data security risk. There's business risk, of which data security and cybersecurity feed into that wider business risk. I think distinguishing between the two almost is quite unhelpful, because the business is always going to win an argument between security and the business, unless there's something like super illegal. But, so I think being able to understand both those worlds is vital.
Interesting. In companies that you've worked in the past, how much would you say the leadership understood the importance and the necessity of having a strong security team, a strong security position?
Yeah, I've been really lucky to be on this with you. The company I'm at the moment, they really get it. I suppose we're a security vendor. We make security software, so there isn't a worse look really than a security software company that succumbs to a breach. That's it happens to everyone, but it would be a very, very, very bad day for me when that happens. And for that reason, the wider company, really are supportive. And as well as we're selling security software, it's good that our sales and marketing team kind of have that as a USP as well. Hey, we're also striving to be secure. We understand because we do the right things ourselves. And again, in banking, I've worked in banking, and again, they're very much, because they have to be, they're regulated. There are rules that if they don't do the right thing, then they're not allowed to trade in anymore. So, for slightly different reasons, I think most companies I've worked for have been really supportive as far as security is concerned. Although I have friends and colleagues where sometimes they struggle to be heard, budgets get cut and cut and cut, and I think that is challenging. And sometimes you either have to disingenuously ride the wave of a security incident. Something bad happens there, then you just go and shove all your funding requests in and your support requests in and capitalize on that. But thankfully, that's not a position I've been in so far. The companies I've chosen to work for have all taken security quite seriously.
Amazing. Okay, so we're at the last question. Thank you, by the way, for everything. I think I learned so much about the way you see things and just the whole field. Yeah, it honestly really interesting. What do you think? What is one piece of unusual advice that you would give to anyone who is thinking about going into security, anyone who's doing something that is maybe like you in the beginning, that is doing something that is similar but not exactly, or that is looking to become a CISO?
Yeah, no problem. I've got two, if that's okay.
Of course.
First, don't feel like you need to know everything, because information security and cybersecurity is a vast, vast subject, and you will never know everything. Be comfortable with not knowing stuff and flip that on its head and ask questions. Be inquisitive. Be that kind of annoying person that midway through a conversation, if there's something you don't know, you need to fact check. Go on Google. Google is your friend in that respect. Find there are a bunch of resources out there to learn stuff. Have a passion for learning, and don't be afraid of not knowing something, because everybody doesn't know something. There's a whole bunch of information security I know absolutely nothing about, and I'm constantly trying to learn. That is, when you enter cybersecurity, realize that you're entering an industry that you will never be finished learning it. And that's okay. That is absolutely okay, so don't worry. First piece of advice. Second piece of advice is, if you feel there's a personal characteristic that you have that will preclude you from being an effective cybersecurity leader, don't let that stop you trying. For example, for me, I have a problem with speech occasionally, as it's been perfectly obvious speaking to you today. And I deliberately do things like public speaking. You saw me speak the other week at InfoSec. And although it is sometimes uncomfortable, I still do it, and I don't let that personal thing with me stop me from doing something I'm deeply passionate about, and that is information security and helping people get into this industry as well. So I say, if there is anybody listening to this that thinks, oh, there's no way I could lead a team because I have this unique characteristic that I think would preclude me from doing it, don't let that be an excuse. If you don't want to do it, certainly don't do it. Don't force yourself into a situation that's uncomfortable for you. But don't feel that anything like that should stop you from engaging in what is, and what I find to be, a thoroughly fascinating and deeply rewarding career. So those are my two pieces of advice.
So one is always keep learning, and feel comfortable about not knowing anything. And then
Yeah.
2 is you can do it even if you think you can't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you could do it even if you think you can't. Try.
Yeah.
It might not be for you. I'm not saying that anybody can do cybersecurity and that literally anyone should and must do this job. There have to be some doctors in the world. We can't all be CISOs. But don't let self-doubt stop you from pushing at that door and trying. And it is worth trying. Like I say, cybersecurity isn't for everyone. We may not enjoy it. The lure of the shining lights of CISO and information security and cybersecurity may seem really attractive on the outside, but when you actually do the job, you may think, oh man, this is like really tedious and boring. Horses for courses. But my point is, don't rule it out without trying it. I think that's a rule for life for anything really. Just always try and do something that scares you occasionally. It's good. It's good for the soul.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris.
It's no problem, Maddie. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so I've stopped the